And what I want to do is look at the New Testament overall and its structure. And this is all very practical. This is all the bones of it. And you might be thinking, oh, do I really need to know this stuff? I would tell you, yes, you need to know this stuff. The structure of the 27 books of the New Testament. So that's the first point in this. It's 27 books written by 9 different people. 9 different people. It was written between 50 AD and 96 AD. All of the New Testament was written in ancient Greek, and that's because that was the common language of the Roman Empire at the time. Now, they would have spoken a form of ancient Hebrew called Aramaic, but they wrote their letters, they wrote their documents in ancient Greek. You can divide the New Testament into 5 sections that are important for us to know about. And the first section is the 4 Gospels. Gospel means good news. That's all it means. It means good news. And the Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're named after the people that we believe wrote each one of them. And within each of the Gospels, it never says Mark wrote this, or Matthew wrote this, or Luke wrote this. But we have our ancient traditions that we'll talk about in a minute that point to who and why they wrote what they wrote. Matthew, it's kind of interesting. All 4 Gospels tell similar stories about who Jesus was and what he did in his resurrection, his life, but they look at it from different perspectives because they're all writing to different people. Matthew is the first of the Gospels because he connects the New Testament to the Old Testament. Matthew's writing to predominantly a Jewish audience. He's connecting Jesus to Moses and the law, and Jesus being the fulfillment of the law. That becomes a theme for Matthew. Mark is the shortest gospel. Mark doesn't mention anything about Jesus' birth. He gets right into it. Jesus' ministry and John the Baptist paving the way for Jesus. In fact, one of the things about Mark that you notice when you read it, and if you want to read a gospel quickly, Mark's the one to read because it's the shortest. But he uses the word immediately a lot. Jesus did this, and then immediately he went here. Jesus immediately helped in this way. The word immediately is there like there's a sense of urgency in the Gospel of Mark. Luke, it was a Gentile. He was a doctor who wrote this gospel. Well, we know a little bit about Luke from the book of Acts. He also wrote that book. But Luke is writing to a Gentile audience, and he begins to talk a lot about the poor and the actions that Jesus took, aimed at a concern for the lost. And then John is the last gospel, and it often gets called the spiritual gospel. We studied that earlier in the year, studied the Gospel of John. But it seems like John, who definitely wrote the last gospel, was probably in his 90s when he wrote it. He probably read Matthew, Mark, and Luke and said, they did a great job talking about the events. I want to tell you the why behind it. I want you to see the spiritual side behind what Matthew, Mark, and Luke have written. That's the first section, the Gospels. The next section of the New Testament is just one book, the book of Acts, which is written by the same person, Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke. And the book of Acts tells us what happens after the resurrection. It tells us about the birth of the church. There are 2 primary characters in the book of Acts. A guy named Peter, who was one of the disciples, and a guy named Paul, who started off killing Christians, imprisoning Christians, trying to purify the Jewish faith and get rid of this new movement called the Way, which was what Christianity was called at the very beginning. Paul wants to get rid of it, but he ends up having an encounter with the resurrected Jesus that changes his life. He sees things literally differently, and he becomes a Christian, and he starts churches all around the Mediterranean. And that leads into the next section. So that's the document called the Book of Acts. The next section of Scripture are the letters that Paul wrote to churches. Now, we call them books, right? We have 27 books in the New Testament. Most of them are letters. Big chunk of them are letters that Paul wrote to the churches that he started. Because what Paul would do is he'd go into a community and he would preach the good news of Jesus and talk about Jesus' resurrection and the power, and people were drawn to that. And he would start this little community, this little church, and he would train a couple of leaders or a handful of leaders, and then he would leave. He would say, all right, this is yours. Now, you know what to do. Share the good news with more people. I'm going to go start another church somewhere else. He would do that. He started church after church, but he would write back to these churches that he had started. And he would say, well, you sent me a letter about this particular issue. You wanted to know, can we eat, for example, can we eat meat that's been offered to an idol, a Roman idol? Can we do that? And he would answer that question. Sometimes he'd get word about a church where they were doing some really creepy stuff. And he would have to write a letter, say, stop doing that creepy stuff, do not date your sister, that kind of stuff. And so he would write these letters that would instruct, that would guide, that would encourage, because there were churches that were being persecuted, and so he would write to them and say, don't give up hope, all those sorts of things. Those letters were circulated. So there's a church in Ephesus, the city of Ephesus, and that letter was so important that the people of Ephesus said, hey, let's share it with the church down the road. And let's share it with another church. And hey, we better make a copy of that, because other churches want it too. So they begin to copy Paul's letters and circulate them around. We think that the earliest document in our New Testament was written 50 AD. 50 AD. And we believe it's Paul's letter to the church in Galatia, another church that he started. And it's his word of encouragement for them. So that's one big section of Paul's letters to churches. And then the next big section is Paul's letters to individuals. He wrote letters to a young man, Timothy. It's a good example. A young man, Timothy, that he had kind of raised up to be a church leader. And I remember some of Paul's words to Timothy as a young man were important to me when I was a young man. And Paul wrote to Timothy, don't let anyone look down on you because you're young, but be an example to the believers in life, in speech, in faith, and in purity. I'm like, wow, yeah, I want to live that out. That's the sort of thing that Paul would write to an individual. But even that individual said, hey, what Paul wrote to me is so important. I want to take it to another church down the road. And maybe they want to read it and hear from Paul. And they did. They want to tell us more about our faith. Help us to live this faith out. Flesh this out for us so that we can live fully into this. Then the last section of Scripture, of the New Testament, would be called the general epistles. And epistle is just a fancy word for letter. Epistle is just a fancy word for letter, and that encompasses the books of Hebrews through Revelation. And these are letters written by other disciples and other people, and include the book of Revelation, which we believe that the gospel writer of John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John wrote the book of John, then 3 little letters, and then the book of Revelation. So these 27 books, you think, okay, they're letters, but we call them books. They make up our New Testament. The question becomes, why those 27? I mean, weren't there other things written, other documents, other letters, other gospels? And the answer to that is yes, there were. But these 27 were chosen over a gradual process for the first 150 years of Christianity. So let's look at the criteria for why these 27 books were chosen. Well, the first reason is common and early usage. These letters were circulated right off the bat as soon as they were written. That earliest one, the earliest letter in the 50s AD, the beginning that we have fragments of Gospels that were written in 40 AD. So that would have been just 10 years after Jesus' death when it was written down. Common usage and early usage. They were circulated around and people knew it. The second criteria for choosing these 27 books was that they're chosen because they were consistent with the faith as it was preached in the churches by the original apostles. And people knew because they circulated the letters, and the apostles were alive. They went around, and so if there was some other teaching that was out of the ordinary, or a writing, a book, a letter of some sort that was not in keeping with the apostles, of course, they were alive to say, that's not me, that's not what we saw, that is not a gospel, that's somebody else's idea, so that one wasn't included, those sorts of things. And the third was apostolic connection. The books were deemed to have been either written by an apostle or written by those who were associated with apostles. That's the case with Mark and Luke. Mark and Luke were not apostles, but Mark followed Peter around and was his interpreter. And so Mark at some point said, okay, I've heard Peter tell the story of Jesus and his resurrection and teaching so many times, it's time for me to write it down. And Luke was a guy who, if you look at the beginning of his gospel, he says, he was an investigative journalist. He said, I interviewed people, and I read everything that had been written about Jesus, and so I'm bringing together this account. The process of bringing those 27 books together is called canonization. Canonization. The word canon simply means measuring stick. Measuring stick. And that means that the ancients brought these books, these 27 books together to say, we want you to use these 27 to be the measuring stick against which you measure everything else. Now, they didn't bring them together and say, these are the only books that are ever inspired ever in the history of ever. No, they just said, measure everything else against these. Measure everything else against these. They are special. Measure everything else against these.